Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Christopher Silver.
I don't know, it makes me sound like I'm some kind of rock star or something. So, anyways, yeah, thank you, Tom Flynn. I appreciate the very nice introduction. So actually, to sort of start off, what I would like to do is sort of take you sort of through our research, and then like to open up the floor at the end for some conversation about it, as well as also talking about a little bit about the media's representation of this. It's very strange being as you can tell from my accent, I'm very much a Southern boy. You know, grew up in the country, was born and raised around cattle. We thought the manure was nature's incense, which is kind of a strange idea, right? Which I'm sure some of you can appreciate here in Western New York, right? And so it's interesting. Anytime, you know, when I present in front of a group or am invited to present or have been, interviewed by the media, I'm thinking, why do they want to talk to me? I'm just this guy that, asked a question, which the question was really, is it really fair for social scientists to try to lump, call it whatever you want, secularization, non-belief, irreligion, whatever term you prefer, but is it fair to lump them all into a single category? And ironically, this is something that occurs quite frequently. It's actually many of the studies, including incredibly well-respected institutions like the Gallup poll and the Pew Forum, who they tried to tease out a little bit some of these categories, but they still sort of focus around this overall group of, are you atheist? Are you agnostic? Are you the religious nun, N-O-N-E, right? Not N-U-N. I guess that'd be kind of strange to study nuns in an atheist context. So what I'd like to do is, let me sort of tell you an interesting story. Has anybody here ever been to Lyon, France? This is an interactive talk. I hope that's okay. Has anybody ever been to Lyon, France? The reason why I start with this is I was just in Lyon about a month and a half ago. We'd originally had gone to an academic conference in Switzerland, and I'm not doing this to be like, look where I went, but where I'm going with this is this. Lyon's interesting because roughly about 100 years ago, there were two important structures that emerged on the hillside of Lyon. One of them was, of course, this incredibly large and massive cathedral, Catholic cathedral, no surprise. And the other one was this incredibly massive metal tower. Now, you might be thinking, okay, metal tower, big deal. Paris has the Eiffel Tower, no surprise. But what's interesting is the story behind these two buildings. One is when the cathedral was built, of course, Catholicism at that time was trying to reappropriate itself. You had the Enlightenment in Europe. You had this sort of you had the industrial era, of course, going on at this time. And so in some ways, Catholicism was trying to show, make a stake, put a claim, build these massive churches. In fact, if just right up the road in Montreal, there's a large cathedral that's been built in the past 100 years, similar kind of thing. But what's interesting is not so much the cathedral as much as this tower. Interestingly, the French, the secularist French, wanted to show that science and reason had just as much of a prevalence in French culture as religion did. And what's interesting is, and you can't tell, and this is a horrible photo. I was trying to find one where it showed them both, but copyright issues, all that fun stuff. I went with photos I took. But the tower is actually 2 feet higher than the cathedral. And the idea was that, okay, so we've both built our structures on the mountain, but we got two more feet on you that you don't have. So I just want to kind of start with that because here we see the conversation 100 years ago in Europe. So one of the common misconceptions that I hear in the southeast United States is, and I'm sure you all have heard it too, is of course America's a Christian nation, right? We hear that a lot, or that our founding fathers were Christian leaders, and and interestingly, of course, as you all are very well aware, Thomas Paine, while he called himself a deist, probably was much more in tune with atheism in many respects, and so we certainly have a historical tradition in this country of reason, of thoughtfulness, of talking about things critically, and in many respects outside of the bounds of religion. So, and then you sort of fast forward to today, and it's funny, we see all sorts of cultural manifestations of secularization. And I'm sure some of these are not at any surprise to any of you. But for example, Nico Ahm was an Austrian who a couple of years ago actually argued that if Muslims are going to be allowed to wear a hijab or a burqa in their picture, he's a member of, he's a Pastafarian. And so his argument was that, you know, because he believes in the flying spaghetti monster, he should be able to wear a spaghetti strainer on his head for his ID photo. Interestingly enough, the Austrian government agreed with his argument, and he had his ID photo made with a spaghetti strainer. And so these are in some ways cultural examples. Now, why is this important, you might say? To say, okay, well, no surprise, Chris. Well, the thing is, a lot of the research right now is saying that 1 in 10 Americans is either atheist or agnostic. Some numbers report higher, some report lower, but on average, we're seeing roughly about 10% who are definitively atheist agnostic. And then, of course, when we get into this topic about about the religious nuns, that number goes up dramatically, right? We see a lot more. And in fact, the CFI recently co-sponsored a study where they looked at college students, and the number was something like 50%. So we're certainly seeing a trend. So you might say, well, okay, Chris, so why do these kinds of examples, why are these important? They're funny, they're comical. But here's the thing, we're seeing a cultural shift. All right, that's what's so important about this, is that we're seeing a cultural shift in the consciousness of, especially of youth, which that's very important, but as well as the rest of society, where people are starting to see religion. You could talk about the sort of comical nature of it, but people are beginning to see religion and question not only the sort of authenticity of a tradition, but we're also beginning to see many people starting to question sort of the cognitive structure, sort of the consistency of religion. Is it truly, is it possible for someone to be resurrected? Is it possible that someone could ascend off the Temple Mount? These kinds of questions, we start talking about things within much different language than we even, did, say, 100 years ago. So certainly interesting. So I borrowed from Gallup. I hope they don't mind. They didn't seem to mind. I called and asked them, and nobody answered the phone. So, but anyways, the dark green represents the sort of more dominant religious fervor. The lighter the color means the sort of more shift towards the secular, or least religious. And so, of course, no surprise, as many of you probably already well aware, my home territory, very green. I guess the grass is always greener on the other side, I don't know. But it's very green down here. You start moving more towards the northeast, and we see, of course, the colors getting lighter. Midwest, pretty, kind of a patchwork of dark green, light green. And then, of course, you move more towards the west coast, and it becomes lighter green to more secular. Compare that with the rest of the world, again borrowing from Gallup. Gallup says that this is actually also what they call convinced atheists. In other words, people who say, I'm definitely atheist, I know I'm atheist. And so, Gallup, of course, is reporting the United States somewhere between 5 to 9%. That pretty much matches the number I was saying earlier on average. And then, of course, we begin to see a variety of other countries. Of course, China, it's pretty close to 50%, although you could argue how much of that self-report is more of a social expectation due to government pressure than it is actually people being truly secular. But then you look at places like Germany, you look, of course, in Europe, Scandinavia, and then, of course, we see a much more organic shift towards secularization. So authors like Steve Bruce seem to be onto something. But one of the problems is that a lot of the research, while we're seeing these social trends, and we're seeing a movement where there's a shift in the social consciousness, okay? We're not talking about 2 or 3 people. We're talking about millions of people. There's a cultural phenomenon that's brewing under the surface. And so looking at these studies, all right, and keep in mind, I'm freshly out of one doctoral program, so in my mind, I'm still a graduate student. I'm gone into another graduate program, so I'm still a graduate student. But in my mind, I was reading these studies where they just sort of lump atheists together, and they lump agnostics together, or they lump the religious nuns together. And I was reading these going, you wouldn't just lump all religious folks together. That's crazy. I mean, it'd be like, let's compare the religious versus the atheists. Well, then that's a boring study because it doesn't tell you anything. So then I started looking for literature that potentially teased out categories. And there's been certainly some attempts at talking about, using terms from popular literature like Dawkins, or talking like, could we call people brights versus atheists versus humanists versus a lot of literature that's talked about those kinds, especially in terms of sort of social advocacy, some in philosophy. But the problem was, especially within my own field, which was psychology, one of the things that we consistently saw was that there was this consistent lumping. So to me, that in many respects was a methodological concern, because if the population is as large as all the numbers are showing, we're not really being fair to that population. So again, to me, I hate to use this term because social scientists hate it, but it seemed like common sense. It just seemed like this group is much more broad and wide than what we're giving them credit for. So I entered a doctoral program, specifically the idea, in an educational doctorate, because that was one of the few programs where I could pull this off, is I entered a doctoral program specifically interested in exploring this topic. And I wanted to understand, is there complexity? And maybe there wasn't. I mean, that's the other thing I had to sort of, as a good social scientist, I had to sort of accept that there might not be differences that exist. And so, of course, when I went into this research, it was very clear that, of course, nothing like this had really ever been done. So we had to be pretty, what's the word I'm looking for? We had to be pretty creative to some degree to try to tease these things out. And one of the methodologies that's very prevalent in sociology and education is the qualitative methodology. All qualitative just essentially means is, it means like conducting interviews, talking to people, rather than giving people a survey, sitting down with people and actually getting their perspective on things and understanding them. So what we did was we designed a two-part study. The first part is the qualitative portion, in which we interview people and sit down with them and talk to them and ask them their feelings and thoughts and ideas and tell us your life story. And essentially went through and asked them what they believed were useful terms to describe secularity or nonbelief, whatever term you want to use. And originally, we thought that if we took commonly used terms, that maybe we'd find some agreement in the qualitative data, and then we could take that and do scientific, empirical-based, survey-based research. Now, ironically, I ended up one Christmas morning drinking whiskey because it didn't turn out the way I thought it would, but it's okay, you guys can laugh. So that's where we started out. The original design was taking popular terms. But one of the other things that we did with the research was that we also included what we call open-ended questions, where we let people essentially provide us their definitions of what they thought things were. And as I mentioned, before I get to the semi-structured narrative portion, we failed miserably, actually. I literally, on Christmas Day, was sitting there with, I think it was a Jack and Coke, I think. It was incredible. But literally was sitting there going, gosh, what am I going to do? I've got this data. Nobody can agree on the terminology. So, like, for example, one person's definition of humanism might not have been the second person's definition of humanism. We ended up having consistent disagreement across the board. But then, and I was working with, and I don't know if y'all have heard his name, my student at the time, he was an undergraduate, still is actually, is Thomas J. Coleman. He's currently suing the local city government, or actually the county commission, county commission outside of Chattanooga, because they open meetings with secular prayer. Sectarian prayer. That's what happens when you have Thai food with Tom Flynn. All right. With sectarian prayer. And so Tommy, fortunately, very much tied into this, it tied into a number of social circles. I of course, have served on the Chattanooga Free Thought Association board for a number of years, and of course have worked within the secularization movement there, but I certainly never had the connections that Tommy had. And so Tommy and I, anyways, just sort of give you a background on Tommy. Tommy and I were sitting there one day, and I was sort of sharing with him my disappointment at where, I was like, well, these terms just aren't working out. I mean, everybody just wildly disagrees with what the terms mean. And so as he and I are sitting here going through and reading people's interviews, all of a sudden we discovered something. It was a very profound it's one of those aha moments, I guess, when you discover penicillin or something. But we started to realize that even though they didn't agree on the terminology, people had definitional agreement, meaning that people actually had different definitions for different kinds of secularity. And they agreed on those definitions, but they just didn't agree on the terms that were the key root word of those definitions, the key term for those definitions. So it turned out, in fact, we actually had something useful and something testable. And then one of the other things that we looked at, and ironically, we borrowed from Fowler's faith development interview scheme, but we adapted it for sort of secular development and talking about people's secular understanding over the course of their life. We created a narrative portion of the study where we actually interviewed people and talked about their development as a person and how did their view of the world, view of secularity, view of atheism, whatever, how did it change over time? And so we tracked that. So in other words, we didn't just want to look at simply sort of an open-ended interview of what do you think these terms mean, but we also wanted to see if we could sort of track a cognitive component of how people see themselves progressing over time. So, so here's what we discovered. We went through, and so instead of coding by the term, we actually went through and coded by common definition, which was incredibly useful and helpful. We also, as I mentioned, we looked at people's development, but we also, the other thing we wanted to look at was we wanted to look and see how people develop social capital. And what social capital is it's like when you have a network of friends, you have a network of people that you connect with, right? All of you bring something to that relationship that benefits the other. So for example, if I'm an IT person, and my friend is a chef, right? I might come and fix her computer, and in turn, she'll maybe make me dinner, or she'll cook, a wedding cake for another friend of mine. That's social capital. It's sort of what benefits do we bring to each other as part of a relationship that in many respects are traditionally non-monetary. And so we wanted to look at that too to see how the social capital changed. And then the other thing that we were really curious about was one of the major concerns I had was that, of course, Tommy was much more connected with the community than I was, and I mean community now in a national sense, was I wanted to be very sure that we didn't just focus on people who were in free thought organizations or secularity organizations. I also wanted to be sure that we found people who maybe identified as a religious nun or identified as agnostic or atheist, but maybe were closeted or weren't public about their value system. We were very fortunate because while we did have about 60% who were affiliated with some kind of, we'll call them non-belief organizations, about 40% of our participants in study one were unaffiliated in any respect. So, and then basically based on all this data, we essentially took the common definitions and the information, and we created a six-type typology of the different types of non-belief, again, is what we call it. Although I don't like that term now. I'm actually thinking about changing it. I'm sure somebody probably will bring that up. So from essentially 59 interviews, we came up with 6 types, which the first is, of course, the intellectual atheist agnostic. And let me say one thing, too, is that as we came up with these particular types from that data, one of the common questions I get when I present this research is people say, well, is this mutually exclusive? And the thing is, with most social science research, nothing's mutually exclusive. In fact, if you look at personality research, you look at a lot of the clinical research, you are going to have some overlaps. Now, when Tom introduced me, he also mentioned I have a degree in religious studies. So the other thing I had to sort of make myself aware of, and John will appreciate coming from a philosophy background, is I also had to be very aware of that there is a spectrum of committed, as we talked about in the Gallup research, convinced atheists, to some degree some people who are philosophically agnostic. So there is a little bit of a spectrum within this. But what we're particularly talking about is modes of behavior, characteristics of the way people interact with others around them. And these are also preferences, meaning that you may find yourself shifting from each of these types over time. So you might be, you may deconvert and be an anti-theist, which I'll talk about in a second, and then find yourself becoming an intellectual atheist agnostic later on. So I just want to kind of preface that as I go through these. So the first one is the intellectual atheist agnostic. And this was actually the largest population actually in the quantitative study, but it was pretty balanced in the qualitative. But these are folks who either want to have a sort of philosophical conversation, maybe they want to debate religion, maybe they want to debate philosophy, or from the sciences perspective, they may be that they want to have a scientific conversation, talk about biology, talk about evolution, but sort of talk about it within terms of sort of an academic structure, an academic paradigm. And so, and these folks are very respectful. They respect others' opinions, although they may hold their own and they may hold on to their own. They're very respectful of others. They enjoy the conversation. They live for the debate. They live for the conversation. But at the end of the day, everybody goes and has a beer and everybody's happy, right? There's no conflict in the sense inferred by this. The second group, which was interesting, although surprised me, didn't surprise Tommy because he is one of these, is the atheist, the activist atheist agnostic. And these are folks who are actually concerned with social justice, fairness. And this extends, by the way, it's not only a concern with, sort of atheist agnostic rights. It's also concerned with gay, lesbian, transgendered rights. It's a concern with the environment and ecology, but it's essentially concerned with making the world a better place. And these people are very active, and they try to do what they can to go out and create social change. The third group is, of course, what they call the seeker agnostic, which this in many respects are folks who they're uncommitted to either sort of the religionist position, but they're trending towards a more atheist position, but they also can't commit to become a convinced atheist either. And it's funny because when I heard a lot of the other types sort of talk about the agnostics, it's usually who they refer to, they're like, I just wish they'd take a stand on something. Right? These folks are completely happy being in the space between. And they're okay with it. Sometimes they call themselves spiritual. Sometimes they'll call themselves a religious nun. But they don't believe in God. They just are trending towards that sort of atheist category. But maybe they recognize that there are philosophical complexities in having the conversation. They're not prepared to have it. They just, in a sense, aren't willing to commit to quote what Tom said earlier, like an ontological position. The fourth group, and keep in mind too, I should mention that each of these categories are terms that myself and Tommy Coleman applied. So in other words, the definitions are what are important. We just tried to use terms that we thought captured generally the description of the types. The fourth category is what we call the anti-theist. Now the anti-theists are interesting because these are people who are very adamant about you knowing their position, and they're very assertive, almost aggressive in that position. They're usually very there's an emotional component to this particular type. Usually emotion is tied to the argument, and that they're very clear that they want to do everything in their power to ensure that religion is removed from the social world to the best of their ability. Now this group's very important, and we'll come back to why they are a little bit later. Another group that emerged, which I didn't see coming at all, was the non-theist. This caught me completely off guard, I have to admit. When we were looking at the data, we had a number of interviews where we had these people just talking about they just didn't care. Like, I don't care about the conversation. I don't care about religion. I just don't care about, they're not, a lot of the people who were non-affiliated atheist agnostics were in this group. They're like, it's just not important to me, Chris. Why would I care to have this conversation? And of course, Southern kid, I always have to give you guys that moment of reflexivity, but as a Southern kid, growing up in the South, I'm sitting here going, who doesn't care about religion, at least at some level? I mean, concerned that they're going to push on your rights or something. So I'm speaking to a colleague of mine in Europe, and he's like, Chris, he's like, come to Scandinavia. He's like, the non-theists are everywhere. He's like, they just don't care. He's like, I don't, my buddy's an atheist. He's like, I don't care. He's like, what's this so surprising? So I sort of stepped back for a second. I'm like, well, I guess it makes logical sense that you do have people that just don't care about the conversation. It's not a cultural concern for them. They're not concerned with sort of the social awareness part of it. And so the non-theists are sort of, as I had a gentleman say to me last week in Huntsville, he said, maybe a better term for this will be the apathetic atheist, or the apathetic individual. And then another group that emerged that surprised the heck out of me, but of course was absolutely no surprise to Tom because of his work with the humanists, was the ritual atheist agnostic folks, which these are folks that actually may still attend church, may still go to synagogue. They find meaning and purpose in the symbolism and the songs, and maybe they sing in the choir, or maybe they're involved in secular rituals, right? Maybe they are involved in some kind of secular movement that gives them meaning and purpose. But the point is, though, is that there are people sitting in the pews right now at church who don't drink the Kool-Aid or communion wine, depending on your perspective. But literally, they're sitting there, they participate, but they don't. They just don't see, they just don't buy into the sort of ontological questions that come out of being affiliated with that particular religious tradition. And so, again, was very surprised by this, but then after rereading some of the interviews, it made perfect sense. And, again, I spoke to another good friend of mine who was Jewish, and she's like, there's so many Jews that are atheists, Chris, it's not even funny, but they all of her friends still participate in cultural practices that are incredibly important to her heritage, and again, makes sense, right? So, no, it's funny too, because when we were getting press, I was going to sort of give you all sort of this from the press perspective as well. A number of the press really dug that we found different types of atheist agnostics. The Christian press really focused on this, though. And I think it was because they found it particularly threatening. And in fact, the Christian Post, the gentleman at the Christian Post was incredibly nice. They interviewed Tommy and I, but the gentleman at the Christian Post spent a lot of time on this type. We talked about the others, but this was really the key point. And in fact, to the point that the Christian Post led with, the title of their story was, "Atheists May Be Sitting Next to You in the Pews Right Now." Some kind of, kind of like scare you kind of title. But, I found out later from a number of good friends of mine in theological circles that after the story ran, a number of ministers ran their sermons based on our research. And we're talking about, is your heart with Jesus? And almost kind of like a coming to Jesus sermon, like trying to make sure are there congregates drinking the Kool-Aid, right? And that wasn't our intention at all. It was actually more to benefit, the secular community than it was to sort of rile up the religious. But that's what happened. So anyways, this kind of gives you an overall snapshot of what we did for study 1, which then, of course, leads me to study 2. And I don't know if you all can see this very well, but the percentages are right here. Now, study 2, of course, we took these descriptions and we distilled them into basically six self-descriptions of non-belief that we asked people. We said, which one of these descriptions best fits you? Firmly expecting that we may not find anything quantitatively, and I was okay with that because the qualitative study in and of itself was really interesting. But so we surveyed about 1,153 participants from around the country. And basically what we found was we found numbers pretty close to what we found when we coded our interviews for study 1, but the largest proportion of types being the academic type. Now, of course, at retrospect now, after having done the study and written up the results, we're beginning to start to think that this academic type is probably 2 types in one, but we had a very difficult time trying to parcel those out qualitatively to be able to do to a quantitative study. So, you know, why make things more difficult than you have to? The point is, I mean, we certainly came up with sort of descriptive characteristics. So, of course, the one that was the largest number was the academic atheist agnostics at right about 38%. Of course, the activists were the next largest group, which was at 23%. The anti-theists was the 3rd largest group at about 15%. Then the ritual atheist agnostics were right at about 13%. And then the what we called the type 3, the agnostics, were almost at 8%. So kind of giving you a breakdown. And then when you look at this in relation to education, one of the common conversations that we always hear is that when the secular community, they're much more educated. And it certainly appears so. I mean, when you look at, and I'm sorry, I'm standing, this is maybe hard to read, I apologize, but when you look at master's degrees or higher, 56%, 57, 64, 42, 62, 67, you see more than half of the sample were educated. So certainly some interesting data there. And then, of course, you look at some of the other demographics. What's interesting, too, though, is you look at those who, of course, have associate's degrees or simply have a high school education. You also have people who identify within the atheist agnostic category. So this is interesting. So you have some folks who maybe don't have higher education, but still, for whatever reason, and I would argue it's a cognitive one, but maybe have a cognitive dissonance related to their faith and have shifted to a more secular type paradigm, which is interesting. So another question I popularly get, and that is really fuzzy, I apologize, is what about our sample as far as a cross-section of the nation? Of course, we're conducting this study in the Southeast United States, so about pretty much half of the population that we sampled was from the South. But we did attempt to try to do relatively decent stratified sampling from the other parts of the country, ranging from 11, 12, 21. We even attempted to try to capture folks living abroad because, of course, we have our military service folks that are overseas, and we felt that we wanted them to participate as well. Although we didn't have that many, as you can see, roughly 25 people participated, about 2.2%. So not much I could really do quantitatively to talk about them versus the other groups. Didn't see any differences other than in the South, in the Midwest, people typically felt that the social pressure and tension was much higher than those who live in the Northeast or the West. Everyone felt that there was still some degree of tension and stigma related to identifying as atheist agnostic, but particularly in the South and Midwest, it was a very much higher proportion. So, and why do I have this twice? Oh yeah, this is the breakdown by region to kind of give you an idea. This gives you, of course, the 6 types based on, like, for example, in the Northeast we had 132 total participants. This sort of gives you the breakdown. The non-theist group really didn't appear until the South, but that was probably more related to sampling. We see the percentages pretty much the same across all 4 of the geographic areas, but in the South, we see the non-theist folks really stand out, and that's where, of course, we were able to, once we combine all the regions together, we were able to make some quantitative breakdown. So again, the numbers, as you look across the different regions, you'll see that the numerical breakdowns, that the percentages of the different types are pretty similar. So the Northeast as compared to the Southeast, as compared to the Midwest, as compared to the West Coast. So again, percentages are pretty similar. So what we're seeing is that regardless of the sort of region of the United States that you live, we're starting to see sort of similar percentage differences regarding the 6 types. So that at least tells us that we likely have some cross sort of national reliability related to these measures. Another popular question, of course, we get is related to age. The height of this relates to the number of people who identified at that particular age. Of course, as is already supported in the literature, there's a lot more younger folks are secular than older folks. But what's really great is that with this study, we did get a really decent cross-section of ages. So, of course, to try to avoid any kind of ethical issues and fighting with my local IRB, I stopped the sampling at 18 because you have to go through extra hoops to get IRB approval if you want to do children. But from 18, our sample went from 18 to 90 of participants, the age range related to that. So, and about the mean age was right around or the average age was right around about 36. So pretty decent. Now, so what measures did we employ in studying the 6 types? So these are survey-based measures that we use, psychometric-based, personality-based measures. And the first one, of course, is like most studies, we had questions related to demographics. Some of this data I just gave you, that's where that came from, asking where are they from, what's your socioeconomic status, what's your gender, what's your age, what's your racial identity, those kinds of things. Then I employed a scale called the Rakesh Dogmatism scale. And there's a number of scales that measure closed-mindedness, but especially in popular measures, the closed-mindedness measures usually measure conservatism or sort of conservative closed-mindedness, which is really problematic because we all know that there are liberal closed-minded people. So Rakesh Dogmatism scale is actually an older scale. It's been used, in fact, it was developed in the 60s, so we're on about 50 years now. It's an older scale, but what's great about Rakesh's scale, besides the fact that there's been a lot of testing of reliability and validity, is that it actually measures both conservative as well as liberal closed-mindedness. It just measures closed-mindedness, which is interesting. So we employed that as a scale. We also used what was called the RIF Psychological Wellbeing Scale. One of the common arguments that I was reading in sort of the popular media was that maybe that atheists and agnostics are neurotic. Okay, let's test it. Let's see if that's really the case. So we included that. We also wanted to look and see, was there a particular personality dimension to being atheist agnostic, and in particular within the 6 types. Another common misconception is all atheists are angry. How many times have you heard that, right? So, great, let's test it. Let's find out. Are they angry? Let's find out. And then, of course, the other one, are they narcissistic? The atheist loves themselves. Okay, if they love themselves, let's test it. Let's find out. So, we did a couple of things. One is we did non-parametric analysis. I'm just going to stick this up for a second, and I'm going to get to the parametric analysis. In other words, we did one type of analysis, just trying to see if certain profiles stuck out for the different types. Turns out they did. The red represents significant differences on the lower. The green represents significant differences on the upper. So non-parametric analysis, we actually found that the particular types had very specific characteristics to them, which sort of confirmed that the types, in fact, are scientifically, there's a scientific validity to them. How far that validity goes is still to be determined because there needs to be additional studies, but we seem to have some validity related to it. So taking this from the non-parametric to the parametric, what I've done is that, again, the stereotype is true. Most of you tonight are probably atheist agnostic, or at least a religious none, and since all of you probably in this room are more educated than I am anyways, thought I would give you a little bit more meat to the statistics. I normally present percentages, so tonight I figured I'd actually present some real data for you to show you, and I'll talk you through it. So what we did was, with our parametric analysis, looking for significant differences of where these particular types are different from the other types. Turns out, when we talk about closed-mindedness, there's not really any difference between these types here. But when we talk about the anti-theists are significantly different from the other groups, meaning that they have the highest score, meaning that they're the most closed-minded, and that the anti-theists are the ones, and remember, these are the folks when they engage and argue, they typically engage with emotion. These are the folks are actually significantly different from the other types. And so to give you kind of a graphical representation, to kind of give you an idea of how this relates to the others, I mean, you see the other scores are pretty similar, in difference, but then you have this huge, massive, right? You have this massive score way up here, sort of giving you an idea of how different they really are. So one of the psychological well-being constructs is what's called autonomy, self-autonomy. How well you can do something independently of others, or do you rely on other people to sort of help you determine and make decisions, do those kinds of things. So in this particular subscale of the RIF, it turns out, ironically, that the agnostic folks have the lowest autonomy score, which is interesting. So all those arguments that my sort of firm atheist friends always make, that agnostics can't commit, turns out they're right. They can't commit. And so there is some data to now support that assumption. And interestingly enough, the ritual atheists aren't any different from them. But then we see another group, and when you see the number appear twice, it means that the ritual atheists aren't any different than this group. So when you look here, the non-theists are kind of their own group. They're significantly different from this lower group of the two types, and this group is the upper group of two types. So you'll see the non-theists are lower on autonomy, but they're not as low as the agnostics. But they're significantly different from these others. Then you, of course, look at here. There's not really much of a difference. Like from here, you'll see that the academics, the type 1 academics, that they're actually different from the non-theists as having a higher score. But then you see right here, the anti-theists have the highest amount of autonomy. It means that, and I'm going to swear for a second, sorry, the anti-theists don't give a damn what anybody thinks. They're going to do what they want to do, and they have the autonomy and believe in themselves to do what they want to do, and the data supports that. So here we see the autonomy score sort of supporting and related to that. And again, you see this huge divide between sort of the type 3 agnostics being the lowest on autonomy, and then you see the anti-theists being high, and you see the variations of the other groups here as well. Does this make sense so far? Yes. Okay, just making sure. All right. So what about positive relations with others, another subscale of the psychological well-being scale? Turns out anti-theists have the lowest score on positive relations with others. Anti-theists are having a rough night. But what's interesting is the ritual atheists score high on positive relations with others. So, and it makes sense if you think about it, because ritual atheists are interested in that communal experience of going to services or participating in choir or connecting with a secular ritual, whatever. So it makes sense that they would, that part of that communal aspect of connecting with others is that they do, in fact, that there is a difference between them and the anti-theist, which, again, when represented, you see the sort of ritual atheists a little bit higher. They're not necessarily significantly different from the other scores, but they are significantly different from the anti-theist, which is certainly interesting. Then when we look at openness to experience, which, by the way, on the Big Five, which is a personality measure, openness to experience also correlates with intelligence. So we can make some assumptions there and even have a debate about it in a second if you all are interested about it. But what we find is that in the openness to experience category, the non-theists actually scored the lowest. But again, it makes sense. Non-theists don't care about the conversation. They don't want to, talk about they don't even want to have a conversation about the topic of religion. They're not interested in it. And then interestingly enough, when we talk about openness to experience, look who's at the top. The academic atheist, no surprise. If it correlates with intelligence, academic atheists do what? They sit and have intelligent conversation and debate. So we do see some of these profiles certainly playing out. And again, to graphically represent it, you see the academic atheist up here at the top, and they're significantly different from the non-theists down here at the bottom. So certainly interesting. And then we talk about agreeableness, and agreeableness in the neo is basically how well you are, some of you are already laughing because you already read the results. Agreeableness relates to how agreeable you are to comply with others and do things with others. Again, the anti-theist, significantly different from the other groups. They have one of the lowest scores on agreeableness. Again, represented graphically here. It's a huge difference from the other groups. They stand out from the other 5 types. Now, what about anger? I know this is one of the ones everybody's waiting for. Okay, what about anger? What we find is actually is that the academic atheists actually have the lowest score on anger. So it's, and I guess that to some degree also makes sense because if you're an academic atheist, you're used to sort of having that objective conversation without involving emotion. Guess who's scoring high on anger? Anybody want to guess? Anti-theists. So they, of course, again, we look, there's the anti-theist way up here. And then, of course, the academics are down here. And then what about narcissism, right? Of course, as far as the lowest score on narcissism, although it's the kind of 3 groups clustered together that aren't significantly different, but they kind of are to get pretty close in score, which is the type 2 activists had the lowest score, and then you look at the agnostic and the ritual atheists are all 3 lower on the narcissism scale. And again, especially for the activists and the ritual atheists, it makes sense. If you love yourself, you're not going to be out there trying to promote social change, right? If you love yourself more than others, you're probably not going to be, participating in communal type services. Then you look at who's at the high, which is the anti-theists again. They're back up in the narcissism, high on narcissism. So again, I'll give it to you visually. So again, you get an idea. And like I said, you look the activists, agnostics. Getting pretty low, and then you look at the anti-theist, and it's pretty high. So what can we say about all this? And that is this: is that one is it's possible, and I'm not trying to throw the anti-theist under the bus here, but it's possible that maybe one of the reasons why this community has had such a tough time, sort of pushing into the mainstream, is maybe there's a small selection of voices who has nothing to do with sort of, to proverbialize the word, nothing to do with their ontological position and everything to do with their personality, but maybe we in our midst have fundamentalist atheists. Just said it. So, and maybe these are the individuals who are holding back progress for the rest of the folks. And right off the bat, we already see some empirical evidence that these folks don't play nice, right? And you may be one, and I'm not trying to alienate you, but the question really becomes is that just like our Christian friends have a huge, they have a huge problem with negative PR when some small fundamentalist group does something crazy like, who's the group out of Kansas? It's, Westboro, thank you. Every time they pick at a funeral, I mean, whose idea is that, right? But yet, in somebody's mind, that's a genius idea. And so, but maybe they're giving the rest of Christianity a bad rap. Maybe we see the sort of same thing in secularization is we see that the anti-theists are kind of ruining the conversation for the rest of the non-belief community. And certainly the data supports that. We see both parametric and non-parametric analysis that supports that these profiles seem to work to some degree. Now, I'm very, very cautious when saying that, though, because, again, we need to do additional research. We need to have others validate this research in other areas and see if they come up with similar dynamics, especially on the empirical side. And we don't need to necessarily go and try to correct social policy as a result of this analysis, but at least it makes us cognizant of two things. One is that social scientists have been doing us a huge disservice for the years because they haven't really been capturing the diversity of the community. And part of when I started out with these cultural examples is that we're seeing a cultural phenomenon that's becoming more and more mainstream. And so as we see more and more adherence out of religion, what you see is you see an incredible explosion of diversity. And so the folks in religion shouldn't be surprised that in the secular community that this diversity exists. The other thing is that we need to sort of also recognize that, especially organizations like the CFI and American Atheists and groups that are trying to sort of raise awareness about the inequality in America today, we also need to recognize that there may be some among us who are doing real good, and there may be some among us who maybe are hindering our progression. And again, I leave that to your interpretation. I'm mainly just presenting the data and giving you some potential interpretive points to think about. Am I a perfect researcher? By no means I'm not, and I'm sure there is probably some great statistician and scientist at Harvard right now that could do this a million times better than I did. But what I at least wanted to do is get a conversation started and try to talk about these things and at least raise awareness that the non-belief community is far more diverse than the social scientists have given it credit. And the road's open and the future looks bright. So I'd like to give credit to, again, Tommy Coleman. Google him. Like I said, he's probably one of the most accelerated undergraduate students I've ever had as an instructor. And then I also need to, every good graduate student always acknowledges their advisor. And ironically, my advisor is a psychologist of religion. So, but is probably one of the greatest minds in that field. And I'm not just saying that as a student. He really is incredibly published and was instrumental in getting me in academia. So I appreciate your time. Thank you. Was that an hour, by the way?
That was a little less than an hour.
Hey, there you go.
Right on. So, folks, you know how the drill works. If you have a question, please come up to the microphone. That way everybody can hear it and everybody will get a fair share. So thank you, and the floor is open for questions.
Thank you.
Chris, great job.
Thank you.
Question for you.
Yeah.
The headlines that reach the popular blogs, the newspapers, we see them, say, atheists are like this, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
They're real clear on a lot of these negative
Of
things.
course.
The anti-sociality, the right, blah, blah.
Yeah.
They're not clear on who and how they're selecting out as atheists.
Yes.
Right? It's a huge problem.
It is a huge
and
problem.
If you read into the fine print, if they give you any details, it's usually, in my experience, self-identified atheists. That is to say, they first have a large sample. The question is, do you identify yourself? What would you call yourself? An atheist, an agnostic, right? And then they lay out some alternatives. And they don't get a lot of people who say atheist. We see the polls, right? Self-identifying atheists is far less than the actual number of atheists. But that's then who they go for.
Right.
I'm going to make a guess, and I'd like you to comment.
Please.
Your anti-theists, they're the ones most likely to say, yep, that's me, I'm an atheist, put the big A on me,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
So we have a chicken and the egg problem.
Yep.
The ones most likely to be out there as atheists are also the ones most likely to get studied as having some of these negative cognitive style and temperament traits. How do you break out of that chicken and the egg problem? In other words, is the answer to say, well, everybody on your list all needs to start calling themselves atheists, but of course most of them, as you found out, don't want to because the jerk is the atheist.
Right. No.
How do we do this?
No, Dr. Your point's very well taken. And in fact, I would argue that social science researchers, and this is where I made the joke about penicillin earlier, but this is the accidental finding, is that I would argue that if social scientist researchers really want to do a good job of measuring secularity, non-belief, pick your term, don't ever use the term atheist or agnostic. Use descriptions of what people think or believe. Well, I don't believe in God, but maybe there's something spiritual. I don't believe in God, I don't believe anything beyond the mundane. But use descriptions, because what happens at that point is that ambiguous category called religious nones becomes incredibly fruitful, as we found. And so, now, there's another issue, too, that's implicit to your statement, I'll state it, is that how do you mobilize those people to get them to stand up for their rights and stand up for who they are? That's the real trick, actually. Now, that's where I see CFI and organizations like you all making a huge difference, is if we can somehow destigmatize. And I'm even, based on the conversation you and I had prior to the presentation, I'm even in a move of saying maybe we should come up with something that's a less stigmatized word, but still does the same, or words that does the same thing. So.
Yes, as your research has shown and others have shown, there is this rise in secularity in our society, and in fact worldwide. But it's impossible to ignore also the concomitant rise in fundamentalist religions that have. And I was wondering if your research and your thinking has in any way been able to account for both of those simultaneous rises in extremisms, or shall we say, at least vocally, very loud positions, polarized positions on both sides. Is there something socially going on here in our generation, the last couple of generations, that this has happened, or is this just a fluke? What do you think?
Well, if we go, okay, if I step out of psychology and step into sociology for a second, and we take the work of Steve Bruce argues that we're sort of headed, even the United States is headed into the secular paradigm. And Steve actually argues that the reason why you're seeing an upswing in fundamentalism is because we're beginning to see the cultural shift to secularization. And so in some ways fundamentalism, I would argue from my research that fundamentalism to some level is actually personality driven as well. But he might even argue that that fundamentalism is actually a response to secularization. So fundamentalism is sort of segregating itself off from the rest of society and creating its own microculture, much like the atheist folks have created their own culture. And they're doing that to try to protect their values, which they know are becoming incredibly socially unpopular. And that's somewhat me theorizing based on what I've seen of the research.
So you're implying that the fundamentalist the fundamentalist rise in fundamentalism is actually a response to secularization rather than just a simultaneous kind of.
Yes. No, I don't see. I see it as. That's exactly what I see it as. I see it as this response to, as we're pushing for more equality and not putting religion in government and trying to have separation of church and state and those kinds of things, they see that as an attack on them personally. And there's an interesting thing I didn't talk about, but in our data too, we discovered that, especially the qualitative data, there's a very difficult paradigm in which when you have stepped out of religion, we talk about religion externally, okay? When you're atheist or agnostic, you talk about, your lack of faith as something external. But when you're in a tradition, a religious tradition, particularly a conservative tradition, your identity and your faith are tied together very deeply. So to say I'm Chris and I'm a Methodist, or I'm Chris and I'm a Catholic, if I see someone who's an atheist, and they say, well, no, I mean, I can talk about religion intelligently. All they hear is atheists. They hear you don't like me. They don't hear you don't like religion. They hear you don't like me. And that's an important psychological distinction that I think has to be made. I almost walked off the end.
They consider it a personal threat rather than just an intellectual opposing idea. Very good.
And in fact, I think, too, that's why you see a lot of theologians become atheists, because they have to learn to think within that intellectual template. And all of a sudden, they find themselves, their identity disconnected from the template. I think it just sort of theorizing a little bit.
Good.
Thank you.
I'm wondering if you could elaborate on the two groups you think composes the type 1 academic, like you mentioned earlier.
Yeah. One of the things. Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. And also, secondly, is there a way to access the literature online to go over it in detail after afterwards? Thank you.
Yeah, you're talking about how to access the research?
Yes. Thank you.
If you go to ProQuest's website, my dissertation is completely available. And then Tommy and I are actually going to turn this into a book, and we're going to report more data than what was in my dissertation. So, I mean, we've got a treasure trove of stuff we haven't even touched yet. So, that we're planning on getting into. But to answer your question about the other, what we saw that the common theme that sort of lumped them together was a concern and interest in the intellectual conversation and having that conversation on a variety of mediums, forums. Maybe they're in some kind of skeptics in the pub kind of forum. Maybe it's sitting around with a bunch of buddies, having a beer, discussing evolution. But generally, this is a person's modus operandi. It's what they like to do. And what makes them different from, say, the anti-theist category is they enjoy the conversation for fun. And like I said, it's such a huge group that, and maybe, here's the thing, another friend of mine posed this argument, which could very well explain this, but maybe instead of that it's really some smaller groups that we haven't teased out, maybe these are just your mainstream atheist agnostics, just like you have mainstream Christians. Maybe the academic atheist is what atheists are. They're academic. So that could be an explanation for why the number is so large. And just like in religious folks, you see smaller groups that do wild, crazy things. You got, non-belief folks that do wild and crazy things. So, does that answer your question? Okay, thanks. Doing the hand thing tonight. So, yes, sir.
I have a quick comment on some of the numbers
Please.
that you had posted. Did you ever do any research with essentially negative and positive controls? In other words, did you put in anger and aggressiveness, say, with Seventh-day Adventists, as opposed to...
Okay, yeah, and actually, your question's well taken. Okay. And in fact, do we have a control condition is really, in some ways, what you're asking. And actually, we don't. Originally, we were going to look at having a control condition to compare these models to, but then we discovered that considering the context of where the research was doing, we would have had to pick a Christian tradition probably, or a Jewish tradition or something. But somebody was going to end up being the control condition, and the politics of that was going to be crazy. So, we sort of made a psychometric mistake to accommodate. I mean, it wasn't a mistake. We deliberately made it in an attempt to sort of not cause a political issue for the university and for us. So
you have an idea then these are where the atheists fall, but where do they fall with relationship to all religions?
Oh, I see.
That's kind of the question mark.
Yeah. Again, based on current literature, and again, I don't have direct data, but based on what I know the current literature, you do see wide variety of different kinds of folks. Like, I'll use Christianity since that's the most obvious target usually. You look in a lot of the Christian traditions, you'll see varieties, sometimes based on denomination, but sometimes it's simply based on personality characteristics, types of Christians you could talk about. And there's been a lot of research done, everything from, like, again, I mentioned Fowler earlier, his developmental styles of faith, which was really popular back in the 80s, to sort of concerns with social and ethical diversity. But there's a lot of data related to that. As far as comparing those, we don't see anything that makes, this may be where your question's implying, we don't see anything that makes non-belief seem like it is somehow alien to the human system. In fact, this diversity is a good thing. If everybody had just been peaking off, especially on the negative scales, we'd have a problem because then it means, okay, these stereotypes do have some empirical validity to them. But actually the fact that we have so much diversity of scores, so many different kinds of groups and different kinds of people with variation is a good thing because it means it is as diverse as we originally thought. Does that answer your question? Thank you. Good question. Thank you.
I'm not sure that you didn't just answer my question, but I'm asking about the sample itself.
Yes.
How much of it was involved in the school, going to the schools, or the various schools, if there's more than one, and how much was totally outside of academia?
Most of it was outside of academia.
Oh, okay.
And we deliberately tried to do that. Now, it's not to say, just like with any kind of stratified sample, when you're deliberately trying to go out, nationwide and connect with people, you may end up having college students participate, but we didn't go. Biggest mistake most social scientists make is they go into a Psych 101 course and hand out 400 surveys. We didn't do that. We deliberately went out. In fact, if you want to find a flaw, the flaw actually is that we really relied on the internet to make a lot of these connections to get these surveys out to people. Now, some people did them beyond the internet, meaning they made paper surveys, but most of it was internet-based. People preferred to do them on the internet because I guess interactive is a lot faster and you can track your status.
And just actually a second question, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But are you going to continue this study over time? Because years ago I was studying religious revival movements.
Cool.
And they very much are economically connected. The worse your economy, the bigger the revival movement, basically.
Yeah,
Is
yeah.
what they come up with. Are you going to continue this over time to see if there's any, maybe not economics, but any other circumstances that influence your results?
Yeah, actually, the plan is, unfortunately or fortunately, I'm also bound by my new doctoral program's requirements and standards, which I'm sure you could appreciate. So I've got to make sure I play ball with what my new advisor and stuff wants to do, but my game plan long term is to stay in this area. I've already made some great connections with a variety of scholars who are also, sort of emerging some really interesting data out of this area. So hopefully, yeah, the answer is yes, and hopefully, yeah.
Chris, I just want to say thanks for the talk.
No problem. I like your haircut too, by the way.
and thank you for doing this kind of research.
Well, thank you.
I think I can practically count on both hands how many people are really looking at this segment of the population is understudied, and I think you hit it home quite well when you. The research has largely been on the religious. And what we know, say, prior to the last 8 years or so, about the non-religious is the other category. And now we're starting to look at atheists as a distinct group, and so I applaud your efforts in that
Thank you
area.
for the compliment. Thank you. I appreciate it. At least you're not throwing tomatoes. That's good. So.
Yeah. Kind of a comment, maybe just more sort of a general question, just your thoughts on it. Because you are studying a unique group that's not a huge part of the, it's huge to us because we're growing, right? And we're the fastest growing religious group in America. I say that as a Canadian, but we're here. But it's only 20%. We're only talking about 20%. And America is interesting unto itself because it's a bit of a religious outlier in the Western world, in the modern world. So I come from Canada. We've got about 30% non-religious. France about what, 50,
Yeah.
close to 50. UK about the same, about 45. Those countries are radically different than the United States, even though they're modern Western world. So you're kind of studying an outlier in an outlier. And I'm wondering, like, what kind of information can we take away from this kind of research when we're looking at such a unique set of individuals, both from an American, being American and being atheist?
Actually, I'm going to say something that's kind of, it's kind of funny, but congratulations, guys. You're all normal. You're just like everybody else. See, but I'm being serious though. I mean, there is this sort of assumption that somehow atheism is this, in the case of my theology friends, they'll say it's this abhorrent thing that's going on. No, it's not. But the thing is it is diverse and it is growing, and maybe we're looking at the next great social evolution of humanity. Maybe we're moving to that next step, and some of us are kicking and screaming, to the gentleman's point a second ago. But, maybe this is the next great step. And if you want to shift from Steve Bruce to another sociology of religion theorist, which is Stark and Fink, if churches and stuff are going to keep up the market share, they've got to come up with another way to sell the product. And, right now, the product ain't selling so well. It's like Sears before the takeover. Anyways. So my point is that if we're seeing this in Canada, of course, I lived in Canada for 2 years and lived in Ontario actually, and it was much common to popular belief among my American friends. Canada is very different, especially when you live there. The social demographics are very different, especially. Maybe the U.S. is just behind Europe and Canada and is catching up. I mean, that's probably what we're starting to see.
Well, I mean, you're probably familiar with Phil Zuckerman's work out of Windsor College, and he studied or did some work in Scandinavia, in Denmark specifically for a year or two recently. And I mean, I'm looking at your data, and I think you got that report back that most of the people in that nation may be I think it was the non-theist group.
Yeah, or apathetic, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
Terms don't matter, the definitions matter. Yeah.
If you believe in a personal God, that's weird there. That's the odd thing. Being an atheist is not odd.
Yeah.
Being Christian is odd. So you might, I mean, I don't know. It'd be interesting to run the stats there and see if that would bear out. Because you would, I think the prediction would be that the non-theist group in Denmark would be massive. Yeah. That would be interesting to find.
No, it would be. And actually, Zuckerman also has this concept of, what is it called, the cultural Christian. I believe Zuckerman has that, and it's an interesting idea that he basically found that type 6, the ritual atheist agnostics, right? This idea that people are culturally involved in religion, but they don't buy into the theology, right? They just go for cookies and communion. So,
well, I think part of that was the state church, and that 80% of Danes still get married in a church, still baptize their children. They're atheists and they baptize their children.
But I would argue that Zuckerman's work even applies here, because we're seeing it here. And like I said, I'm not the only one to sort of show this kind of data where there are people going. There was a gentleman, and his name escapes me, who was doing similar research in Holland too. And so we're seeing it more frequently. So thank you, I appreciate it.
So I want to go to the slide that you flashed about the anger issues.
Anger issues, yes,
and
ma'am.
Two things struck out on that slide as surprising me.
You want this one more?
First of all, I love the idea of multidimensional anger.
Yeah.
But yeah, so some of the things that surprised me on this were that the activists were on the low end of the anger scale, because I know a lot of the activists that I am familiar with, whether it's in our movement or just in any other sort of movement, a lot of that motivation to become involved and to move from academic to activist is based in sort of an anger at what's going on. So I was really surprised about that. But I was also surprised that the type 5 non-theists, the people that just kind of really don't care, are not interested whatsoever, that they were higher on the anger thing. So that made me think that something else might be going on, or that anger thing might have some other dimensions to it besides kind of what we typically think of. So I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit.
Well, and actually, this is one of those where I give you an answer I don't know, because at this point, this is a first stab at this. And so the next step actually would be to go and find non-theists and study them specifically. And this would be a great point where qualitative would be useful, because then you could interview the non-theists and say, well, okay, tell me about why you're angry, or do you have it? And here's the thing too, is that while we have variations of anger, the anti-theists are the ones that really have the significant score, right? It's much higher than the other groups. And so, in fact, I'll pull up the comparison slide. So, I mean, you look at sort of the differences here in where are we? Here we are. They're not significantly different from the anti-theists, but they are up there, to your point. So, I can't answer your question, because again, I don't know. I mean, I'm welcoming anybody who might want to make a theory. Why?
I think I might be able to take a sort of stab at that one. I think it's a little bit about how we define anger. I'm thinking how this inventory is defining anger is probably different than what we commonly use as the angry atheist. We have an idea of what the angry atheist looks like.
I can speak to the scale, and maybe this will help clarify too, is that the multidimensional anger inventory looks at different modes of how anger manifests in people as a general mode of interaction. So in other words, do you find yourself angry a lot versus a little? So it's, in other words, a continuation of anger versus, I mean, all of us get angry. So all of us would score something on this, but it's like a frequency of anger and a sort of a valence, like a valence issue of how much anger you have. So, no, again, I can't answer your question. You can.
But I think very often the atheist activist is really somebody that's very passionate about social issues and whatnot, and that internally motivates them to sort of get off the couch and do something about it. I consider myself that type of person, but in my day-to-day life, I'm extremely, well, I don't know if it's passive, but I'm very, very low-key. I would score very low on the anger inventory, but I get very activated and passionate when I see injustices based on religion or race, for that matter. And it really activates me to get out there and be very kind of loud, air quotes. So I think it's the way we're using the word angry, and I think we've been mislabeled as being angry. A lot of us have been mislabeled as being angry, not just the anti-theists. We've been lumped in, not with the anti-theists, but I think just atheists are labeled as being angry by existence sometimes.
Well, you've just answered most of my question. I just wanted a little bit of clarification on something, I guess,
Yes, sir.
now. You have your activists. I consider myself an activist. I consider myself an academic atheist. I also identified almost immediately with the anti-theist. I am very clearly anti-theist. But just so my girlfriend doesn't get too scared,
Yeah.
I didn't identify with...
She already gave me her number before the talk. So. No, I'm just kidding. She smiled at it. She's like, yeah, I did. Yeah, I'm just kidding.
When I saw activist, I thought to myself, someone's promoting secularism and reason and science and things like that, which is clearly what I see myself as being, someone who does that. Anti-theist is someone who is against the theism. And I am against theism. I see it as a social evil. It has done a lot of very bad things in this world. I don't feel bad about being anti-theist.
No need to be.
So, I can be both academic atheist, activist atheist, anti-theist. But as I was thinking about things, other people were talking, and especially as the last comment was being discussed, a question came into my mind is, why do you have it? To my mind, it seems like you had it parsed out where activists are promoting like secularism and things like that. Anti-theists are just the people that are against theism. But I see being against theism as part and parcel of what we're trying to do as being these more non-angry, more socially comfortable activists. So I don't understand how the two... Is there a gradation from activist to anti-theist? Can you not be both?
Well,
I'm unclear on the definition. Maybe I'm just unclear on your definition of the anti-theist.
Well, keep in mind the term anti-theist is just a term we applied to a definition. Again, it was common definitions. The terms we pulled out of the air to try to best fit the definition. Let me also say this, that the activist perspective, in many respects, they're not just only concerned with issues of secularity, social concern with secularity. They also generally are concerned with social justice in a variety of forms. So it's a much wider sort of gaze of scope of what their interests are. And it's not to say that someone couldn't be an activist who's very assertive and concerned with religion and the negativity that comes along with that, or to quote you, the evils that come along with it. What differs the two is your modus operandi of how you interact with others and how your behavior, your personality, the things that allow you to connect, how you debate with other people. So that's really the defining characteristic in some ways. So you very well could be an activist and want to see social change, but the next step is, and this is where the dividing line would probably be, is how do you, say someone comes to you and says, we should make Christianity the state religion, what's your next step? And what's your next step in a lot of ways, or how you address that, if you do it, very calmly and say, well, let's discuss this, let's debate this. That may be more the activist role. If you get emotional and you find yourself, and it's ironic that the anger inventory went off the scale because a lot of the narratives that we found were people just angry at the world and mad and wanting to push for change. But they wanted to push for change because they believed they were right and the rest of the world was wrong. And that's fine. There is, for all of us, in whatever position we have in life, we have some degree of personal truth that informs that. So, but I would say that probably the key dividing line there is the sort of the response factor, the behavioral factor, the personality factor to some degree of that. Does that answer your question a little bit more? And these are preferences too, so they can, when I open, they shift. So you may find that you used to be an anti-theist, then you became an activist, or you could be an academic that shifted. So they are fluid in that regard. And as is the case with most psychological research, nothing's ever compartmentalized. Gosh, I wish it was. It'd make things so much easier for those of us publishing. But there is some interplay between these. Or as the statistician would say, there's some shared variance. But there is enough distinct variance to support the claims of the types from what we've seen so far.
Okay, well, I do see a clear evolution of my position. And oddly enough, anti-theist wasn't the beginning of it. It was
Interesting.
the middle.
Yeah, and it's weird, I'm almost making an assumption that's kind of the starting point too, but for some people it may not be. And to the gentleman's point earlier, it could be, you know, you get into this and you've sort of gone through the motions of having the debates cognitively, and the cognitive dissonance pushes you out of religion. And it may be that you just want to be a good person, help society, and then, you know, a priest molests a child, and then there's, you know, all these other negative examples in media, and one day you find yourself angry, and you're like, what is this, you know, why do people keep doing this, you know? So there's nothing to say. I guess I'm sort of insinuating or implying an evolution of the types, or, you know, from an individual's perspective, but I think it's probably more fluid in the sense that people could bounce between them based on preference. But everybody, from what we saw in the research, people seem to really have a preference.
Did you ever consider studying the evolution that people take?
It would be great. I just need a grant. See if I need a grant to. No, but yeah, I mean, it would be great if we could study sort of a longitudinal design and study how these people have changed. I think it'd be awesome. I appreciate your comment. So you can stay with him. He's a good guy. So.
Well, I have a comment and a question.
Yeah.
My comment is, one thing you were mentioning that a religionist, well, if you tell them that you're an atheist, they immediately think, oh, you hate us, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I believe that's almost the reverse.
Really? Interesting.
Well, religionists are really afraid of atheists. And why do so many people want to stay in the closet if you're a non-believer? Because you're afraid of rejection from the religious community.
It's a very good point, yeah.
Don't you think?
No, it is. It's a very good point.
And I also think that a lot of groups that are coming from being in the closet, being good citizens because they're not making any waves, all of a sudden when they start making waves, oh, they're so angry, like the blacks, women, you know, why are they so angry when they're just trying to say, hey, I want a piece of the pie, you know what I mean? So I'm wondering about this. I think a lot of them Christians or religionists, not necessarily Christians, but religionists would just label all of them as angry. But this gentleman before me, he was starting to get to what I wanted. Can you give me an example of an anti-theist organization? Are AAs? CFI, where does CFI stand? Where does Freedom from Religion stand? Or an individual?
Of someone who would fit this particular type?
Right, or an organization.
Well, the problem with the organization is it's really difficult to try to fit an entire group of people into a particular type, personality type, or that lack thereof. Yeah, actually, I can give you an excellent example. There's a gentleman back in Chattanooga. I won't say his name, but I'll give you a very detailed profile of him for a second. There's a gentleman, a good friend of mine, who is incredibly verbose about his position, and he very aggressively tells people on a regular basis that they're crazy and asserts himself in a way that's not socially acceptable in some of the contexts in which he, you know, pushes his values and ideas. When someone argues with him, and particularly when he's beginning to sort of lose the argument, becomes very angry, very aggressive. Many times he'll just call people stupid and walk away versus trying to have a civil conversation. And it's funny because, again, on the qualitative side, keep in mind, we didn't have any of the quantitative data at first. We had just had these interviews and the definitions. It was funny because when Tommy and I were sort of taking all the descriptions, trying to fit them together to find the ones that were similar or exactly the same. And when we sort of had first formed the anti-theist category, we knew, he and I both said, I'll call him John. His name's not John, but we'll call him John. Tommy and I both were like, John. We knew. I mean, we were like, that's John. But John, in some ways, John's involved in activism to some degree. But he also, where you have a lot of activists in the group who are really trying to do good things and make social change, he stands out a lot as being the rabble-rouser, problem child, to the point that a lot of the other activist folks, a lot of times will say, well, hey, why don't you help us with a website? Like they don't want him to socially show up.
So you're thinking this one individual in that community is giving all atheists or agnostics.
But that's exactly what happens. In fact, they were recently at a gay pride festival they have in Chattanooga. Yes, we have one. We have a gay pride festival. And he was there, and he showed up, and everybody was like, oh, God, what's he going to do today? And he was surprisingly good, but there is this concern. And again, we didn't model this after him. The data is what sort of formed these types, but it was very obvious that he fit perfectly.
So you wouldn't identify, I'm a real big fan of Richard Dawkins. He's really out there, and some people don't really like Richard Dawkins too, because they feel like he's too much out there. So where would he fall?
Good question. Dawkins would have to take the survey.
Okay.
Yeah, and again, I wouldn't dare try to tie Dawkins because I'm not his hell.
I agree, but I'm just kind of wondering, where are these really angry ones out there that have given us a bad name? That's more like a localized type of...
Well, and this is one example. Just for an example, I can't give you an organization because organizations have multiple people.
And fundies have their problems because they have these loudmouths that make us all color all Christians or all religionists. That's crazy.
But like, for example, Tommy and I were my co-researcher, we're talking one day, and we wondered if who's it? It's on HBO every Saturday night. I love his show. Bill Maher. Tommy and I were talking about one day, what if Bill Maher was an anti-theist? Because he is very controversial sometimes. But again, it's not something we could ever classify for him. He would have to take the survey, read the description, see which one best fits him, and then check him psychometrically to see if they fit.
That's kind of his stage persona, too.
And it may be a stage persona. Yeah, there's that, too.
I'm sure that's how he feels, too, in a way. He comes across natural. That is still his stage.
But yeah, I'm sure if you hang out with him and get a beer, I guess in his case, a pot, he probably is a fun guy to hang out with and is very socially acceptable. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I think I'm fine on the last one.
Okay.
My question is about the back data that you have, so other data you've yet to interpret. And in particular, I wondered whether you have information on the occupation of the individuals. So you gave some information on education.
We didn't check occupation. We didn't check occupation. Great question. It would have been interesting to do that. I will give you a snippet, though. The back data, one of the things that we looked at was there's some popular work been done in the field of spirituality on this whole spiritual not religious, religious not spiritual, neither spiritual nor religious, and both, right? There's been a lot of work on this category. And so one of the things that we also looked at was we asked people to tell us where they stood at age 6, 13, 18, and now. And what was amazing was a lot of people considered themselves in their youth religious, not spiritual, and then there's this shift through spirituality to sort of secularization. So in some ways it seems like the data seems to suggest that there's a spiritual bridge, right, that gets everybody from religion to secularization. And we haven't announced that to anybody yet, but that's what the data shows so far. So there you got a piece of the book that we have shared.
The other thing I wondered is, are you in the progress of making a continuum here, of aligning like types with each other so you can start to see what the name rank groups are?
We've actually looked at that. One of the things too, again, I'm still not comfortable with that academic typology. And so I've got a colleague of mine I don't know if he wants me to announce where he's at yet, but I have a colleague of mine who's doing a similar study using the types, and we'll see what he finds. But I still feel like the academic type's probably more than one type. But the problem is qualitatively it was very difficult to try to parse those out without running into some ontological issues. So.
I make one quick point. Someone mentioned Finland.
Yes.
As being very a-religious.
Yes.
And I think I remember you correctly, I heard that of all the school systems in the whole world, their students are the highest in math and science. Just a good point to think about.
Yeah. So you're saying I need to move to Finland? No. Well, I have a son, so maybe I do need to move to Finland to make sure he does well in school.
Well, I want to thank Dr. Silver, and will everyone please join me in